Here's me taking time. I, at some point during the course of my PhD, decided to go away for a few months. Went away for a few months to southern France and stayed there to do some writing. And while I was there, at some point got frustrated because I spent a full 2 weeks working on a single paragraph because I just couldn't wrap my head around for a full 2 weeks. And the most frustrating thing in the world was at the time that my partner who'd walk in and out of the house be like, "So, did you make progress today?" I'm like, no, I didn't make progress. I'm still stuck on the same paragraph.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach Podcast. My name is Derek, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ethar, one of our trusty coaches, and we're going to be talking about the 3 most common struggles that new and first-time researchers almost always face on their dissertation or thesis writing journey. If you're new to the sometimes daunting world of academic research, you'll definitely want to catch this one. Also, be sure to grab a copy of our free dissertation and thesis template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. So, without further delay, let's get the party started. Dr. E, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So let's talk struggles. And the first struggle is one that if we were to judge by the feedback that we get from students approaching us at Grad Coach, is certainly the most common one. And that is having a difficult advisor or supervisor or whatever official support you're supposed to have from your university. Dr. E, why is this such a big one? And what are students supposed to do about it?
Well, you're absolutely right. First and foremost, it is one of the most common problems that a student will encounter. It's one of the most predictable problems that a student will encounter. And likely because there's a confusion in terms of what you're expecting when you enter into your research degree, whatever that might happen to be, and what you think your supervisors or chairs or committee members are supposed to be doing for you. Now, everybody knows what this problem is like, from chairs, supervisors, committee members, whoever it might be, who aren't really giving you the best advice, or maybe they're really, really slow to reply, or maybe they don't seem to be that interested in your project, or maybe in the worst case scenario, you often feel like the goalposts are being moved. So sometimes, you do something that you think they want you to do, or you produce work that you think they're trying to ask you to produce, and then submit it, and suddenly you find that you've done everything wrong, and you get disappointed and frustrated, and now you don't know what you're supposed to do next. And you feel like it's almost as if they're out there to kind of stop you from succeeding. And that's absolutely not the case. So there's a couple of things that you need to know upfront, or at least a couple of things that you need to be familiar with upfront before you can get to the point where you can kind of be more familiar or comfortable with your supervisors, your committee members, or your chairs, which are that, look, they're not the embodiments of academic gatekeeping. Well, I mean, kind of. Maybe a little bit, but not completely. They're not entirely that. They're not people that you necessarily need to impress. These aren't people who are there to be your friends, as horrible as it is to say, although sometimes they can be. That's not really what they're there for. Their primary concern is to give you the tools necessary to help you meet the qualifying criteria to be able to pass your degree, or at least to get to the point where you can defend your degree successfully. That's their only concern. That's their only goal. And sometimes that might feel a little bit cold. Sometimes that might feel a little bit clinical, and sometimes that might feel a little bit distant, particularly if this is the first time you're entering into research and you're looking for a hand-holding, you're looking for a Sherpa or a guide the whole way through this process. And as much of a mountain as this may feel like to climb, unfortunately, your supervisor really isn't going to be that Sherpa. Now, we might be, but that's not the point. Your supervisors or your committee members or your chairs certainly aren't there for that. They're there to make sure that from a clinical perspective, from an objective, straightforward, criteria-based perspective, you can meet the requirements you need to meet to make sure you get to that defense and that you successfully conduct it. That's the main thing that you need to bear in mind.
Yeah, so true. It's part of the reason that we suggest, and we have a separate video on this, which we'll link to below. We always suggest having a sort of roles and expectations discussion with your advisor as early as possible. Ideally, the very, very first call that you get on. And what you want to establish is, well, as I mentioned, what the roles are within this relationship and what the expectations are, primarily from their side. You might want to communicate your expectations, but you don't really have the authority in this relationship, and that's the nature of it. And so it's really useful to have that conversation right up front so that, one, you understand what their role is as a supervisor, you understand what you can realistically expect from them and what you can't expect from them, because that can vary between supervisors. Naturally, these are humans, and so there is some variance in what will be provided to you in that relationship, regardless of what the actual institution prescribes that supervisor is supposed to do. And the other thing that it achieves is that it it creates a commitment on their side from the outset as well, that they've said, I'm going to help you in this way. And so at least hopefully at some subconscious level, they then feel a little bit more bought into the role that they're providing in the relationship. And so that's really, really important. You want to have that discussion right up front. You don't want to roll into the relationship with all sorts of wild expectations and then really only have that conversation when things break down. That's not where you want to be. So that's something you want to do really, really early. And related to that, ideally, you want to have some sort of project plan or engagement plan that you've put together with them, or at least presented to them and got their buy-in on, as to how you're going to work together, what things you're going to touch base on, how often you're going to touch base. And so again, this is just about setting expectations and setting some sort of framework in place from day one, so that it's not just up in the air. It's not just you sitting there waiting to see like, okay, what is this person going to do for me and what aren't they going to do for me?
No, you're absolutely correct about that. I feel like you're triggering me slightly because I've got like memories and flashbacks of my relationships with my supervisors that I feel like I could have managed better during my master's, my PhD, a little bit of my bachelor's degree. Like there were a couple of, okay, I'll tell the truth. A lot of it was in the bachelor's degree, but that was partly my own fault. But the point is that you're absolutely correct. There were instances and moments in which those relationships could have been handled better. That you could have had those conversations at an earlier point. It would have saved me a lot of trouble, a lot of frustration, a lot of confusion in terms of my expectations of what that supervisor or that committee member or chair would be looking for from me, what they're expecting from me in terms of the work that I will be producing, and then what my expectations are from them in terms of what they can do back in return for me. I'll give you a case in point, little story time now that we're here, and triggering a memory now, so I got to deal with it. Like, we've got to get these out. But there was this particular situation where I had a supervisor I was debating with for a good 2.5 years on a very, very particular point. And precisely because at no point had I had the conversation with him in terms of what I expected him to do or what I would like him to have done. Now, again, like you're right in what you're saying. I'm not in a position to make the demand, but we are in a relationship and we are engaging. There's a back and forth here. And to some degree or another, he or she or whoever that committee member may be is committed to a degree, at least, to making sure that you kind of make the progress that you're supposed to be making through the course of your PhD, master's, bachelor's, whatever it might happen to be. And in that particular case, 2.5 years of us arguing on a single point, I was absolutely convinced I was right about it. I was absolutely convinced I knew what I was talking about. And somewhere 2.5 years down the line, he eventually decided to pick up a book off the bookshelf, which was the book that we had been debating for 2 years, blew the dust off of it, opened it up, and then went, oh, actually, I think you'll find you're right. Now, see, this drove me nuts. But the fact is that at no point had I expected him to do that work. And at no point had I made the effort to make it clear to him what I was trying to achieve, what I wanted him to think about, or the direction that my work was going in. It was almost as if I was assuming that he should know what it was that I wanted to do. I was assuming that he should know what kind of success I wanted to have with regard to my degree at the time. And I was assuming that he would be as engaged as I would be in that same work. And the truth of it, it's just an unfair expectation, particularly considering they're going to have multiple students. You are not the only person they're taking care of. There will be multiple degrees that they're taking, multiple students, that they're taking care of, doing various different projects, working in various different areas, all of whom have the same, perhaps sometimes unnecessary expectations or excessive expectations, but all of whom they have to be able to serve to some degree or another, and all of whom they're supposed to be helping. And this isn't an easy thing to be able to do. So you're absolutely right in what you said. The most important thing is going to be your communication with this individual. It's a relationship like any other, and being as frank and honest as you possibly can be in the process. Now, I'll just say that it's not to say that these relationships don't sometimes break down. This happened. Divorces happen. Take it easy. They happen. But when that is the case, it's something, again, if you had been frank, if you're honest, if you're straightforward in both your expectations, your frustrations, your challenges, your difficulties, and what you're looking for in terms of support, it's much, much easier to manage. And if you get to the point where you feel as though the relationship between yourself and your supervisor or your chair or committee member is breaking down, you can at that point, perfectly reasonably start to consider the possibility of changing. So you can have a conversation with them and say, listen, I'm not entirely sure this relationship is as functional as I would like it to be for the following reasons. Do you agree? And if so, is there something we can do about this? How do we feel about changing supervisors or changing committees or chair members in order to make this, as I said, more functional, more successful, and more productive a relationship? It's really about honesty.
Yeah, and I think, taking a few steps from that back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, is that it's useful to remember that this supervisor, this advisor that you're working with, to them or to you, they're, this one person that you're interacting with. And of course, you have great expectations. from their side, when you look at it from their perspective, very often, it's not always the case, but very, very often, these supervisors are absolutely overwhelmed with a workload in terms of what they're doing in their university, what they're doing from a research perspective, and then, of course, all the students that have been allocated to them to be supervised. And so it's useful to understand that. It's useful to understand that you're dealing with a human that's probably got a lot on their plate. And so what does that mean for you? Well, it means that ideally, and I've got to be careful how I position this, but ideally, you want to try and make their life as enjoyable as possible when they engage with you. In other words, you want to try and be, I don't want to say favorite student because that comes with all of its implications, but you want to be someone that they look forward to interacting with. And so what does that mean? It means that you show them that you're coming to your sessions prepared. You show them that you're taking their feedback and you're really thinking about it. You show them that when you come to them with some problems or some challenges, you're not just puking a whole bunch of challenges onto their plate to deal with, but you're also coming with potential solutions. You want to be going to them with, I've got this problem, I've thought about it a little bit, these are the 3 potential routes I'm thinking about taking, what are your thoughts on that? As opposed to just going to them and saying, I've got this problem, help me, because that is most likely what they're getting from all the other students. So you want to think about those ways in which you can demonstrate that you value the relationship, that you take it seriously, and that you are putting everything into it. Because if you just do that, you're really going to stand out from the rest of the crowd. And again, the supervisor is a human, and they are going to be prone to, a little bit of favoritism in terms of that student that always comes prepared, that comes organized. They're going to be more benevolent towards you, and they're going to perhaps make a little bit more time for you and be a little bit more invested in you than others. And so this isn't about, trying to be teacher's pet or anything like that. It's just about showing that, hey, I'm invested in this relationship, and hopefully you can see that, and hopefully you're going to reciprocate.
Absolutely. Just to be clear, we're not saying, as you said a moment ago, that doesn't mean like turning up with an apple for every single meeting you have, or bringing some baklava or something for every meeting you have, and like, here's some sweets, I love you. It's not that. That's not going to get you over the line. I mean, I think the underlying thing is the ownership that you feel over the degree that you're conducting, whether that's a bachelor's, master's, a PhD, or somewhere in between. The fact of the matter is if you are invested in it, if you care about the progress of your work, if you care about the functional nature of that relationship, and you want to keep it honest, you want to keep it successful, you want to keep it moving forward, so long as that's the case and you're taking ownership of what it is that you're doing, and it really, really, significantly matters to you in a meaningful, substantive way, not just in the symbolic, I want this degree type way, but I actually care about the next step, and I actually care about doing the work to get to the next stage and reading this particular text and understanding this criticism from the supervisor or otherwise. So long as that actual care and concern, that ownership of what it is that you're doing is there, they'll be responsive, because ultimately that's what they're looking for. More than anything else, it's not exactly as you said, they're not looking for themselves to be the person that drag you through the whole process from beginning to end. They're looking for you to be able to take the initiative, make the progress, and then turn to them when necessary for guidance. But ultimately, it's your degree, and you treat it as such.
All right, so let's jump on to struggle number 2. And that is that typically the research journey is a rather long, lonely road. And this results in students having a whole lot of issues. So Dr. E, what do students need to know about here, and how do they manage the plethora of issues that come along with being on their own and trying to map this landscape in isolation?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. First and foremost, this is a very, very common problem. It's kind of built into the nature of research. It's kind of how research works. There's no real way of avoiding this issue of isolation, the need for time management skills that's going to come up at some point. But let's face it, everybody knows what this is. As soon as they enter into research, large quantities of what you're doing are being done in isolation, especially when there's an absent supervisor or chair or committee member who isn't really helping you as much as you'd like them to be. Often the progress that you're making then just feels self-assessed. You're not really doing this with the guidance of somebody else. You don't really feel as though there's somebody holding your hand the whole way through the process. And to some degree or another, this is a residue of the experiences that you've had in every educational institution leading up to this point, where it was much more of a communal environment. There were other students or other people who were studying alongside you that you can kind of talk to and turn to relatively easily, mostly because they're in the same classroom. There's a teacher who's guiding the class in every single instance, and there's a whole institution that's very, very present the whole way through the process that you can always turn to whenever you need some help. As soon as you enter into research mode, suddenly the burden shifts almost entirely onto you, and you can't help but feel as though you're very, very lonely. You're the only person who knows what they're doing, and this is all just down to you. Now, this is one of the things, as you said, that we should be aware of. This is what we kind of refer to as this silo effect type thing, where you just feel as though you're kind of functioning within this tiny little silo. It's just you on your own doing all of this, and you're kind of immersed into the research. And as I said a moment ago, there's a natural degree to which this has to be the case. Nevertheless, there's a myth involved here, namely that, yes, while it is true that nobody else is going to know what it is that you're doing, nobody else is really as familiar with your research as you are going to be. I mean, I say this very often to some of the people we work with on Grad Coach, that as much as it's my job to understand how to progress you from point A to point B through the work, and it's my job to make sure I understand the qualifying criteria to get you from point A to point B, ultimately it's your job to be the expert in this field. It's that you're going to be the one who is the expert. This is your contribution. It's your field. As we said a moment ago, you take ownership over what it is that you're doing. So in some respects, or to some degree, it is going to be entirely yours. It is going to be entirely you doing this on your own. But that doesn't mean there aren't people in exactly the same situation. So while they don't necessarily share the same expertise, and nor should they, and while they don't necessarily share the same understanding of the topic material, and nor should they certainly share the experience that you're having at the moment. So whether that's the experience of being alone, or the experience of the difficulties of research, or the experience of struggling with a supervisor, for example, or a chair member, or struggling to get to the next phase of research, it really is just a matter of reaching out. And it can feel like it's particularly difficult to do at times, because it's hard to start bridging that gap and understand how I'm supposed to reach out. But it's those common experiences that you can call to. So there are going to be other researchers either on your campus or in your university. There are going to be other people, other academics that you can turn to and just talk to about your experiences and vent. And, if nothing else, not even if nothing else, really near the top of your list, there's us. You know what I mean? Like, we were right here. Like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm right here. Like, you can always just turn to a group of academics who are more than ready to listen, who are more than ready to kind of engage with you and share stories with you and share experiences. I mean, look, I've done this myself. I'm sure, to some degree or another, you have too. And all the other kind of coaches who work at Grad Coach have had similar experiences where you just kind of find yourself brooding alone in a corner of a library somewhere, or in the corner of your room on your own, sat on your desk, staring at the same piece of literature review document content that you've been staring at for however many weeks it's been, and by now you're exhausted. We've all been in that situation. I've done it myself. But as I said, there's a temptation to want to kind of hunker down in that silo effect and just feel as though it's kind of refusing the rest of the world, and you end up in some Aristotelian cave somewhere, just in the darkness, watching shadows moving around. But at some point, there's a meme that I've seen, just like, for God's sake, leave the cave. Just go outside. there still is an outside. And as much as it might feel like you're just trapped on your own and it's just you doing this, I swear the shadows are an indication of there being sunlight out here. You can't come outside. You can say hi. So on the one hand, there's this issue of just engaging with other people and sharing those stories with other people, and just trying to talk to other people, creating a community, even if you have to create one for yourself, even if that means just carving out time for your own leisure activities. And this is where time management starts to become an important piece of the process, which is that you want to build in breaks. Even as much as you might want to achieve success, and I'm guilty of this myself, and be the first one to admit it, I'll overwork. You know about this. I know you know, Derek, but it's cool. I'll overwork and I'll overdo what I need to do. And I'll spend way too much time committed to my work, and way too much time committed to my clients, and way too much time committed to my studies or whatever it is that I'm doing, and not carving out the time that I need for breaks. But this is infinitely important, even if it is only to be able to kind of step away from what you're doing, catch a breather, and then engage with a little more energy and return back to it. I'm reminded of, it's a very, very small point, but it's a very, very interesting one, where in the 1950s or 1940s, 1950s, when they first started filming airplanes in the sky and kind of doing these massive movies with airplanes, what they realized very quickly is, unless you have clouds in the background, you can't tell whether or not the plane is moving at pace or moving at speed or going as well. So you needed that differentiation. And it's the same thing in this respect. That's to say, unless you take a break away from your research and you take a step back from it every now and then, just to have a break and have a breather, you can't differentiate. And it's very difficult to see whether progress is being made, or what ground you've covered, or how you've gone from point A to point B. You just feel like you're stuck in that same place and grinding away at the same thing every single day. And after a while, it gets exhausting. So absolutely right to try to build in break time. Try to re-engage with your existing social circles, or find some new academic social circles, or type in a little gradcoach.com onto the website, onto your internet browser, find out what happens, get to know, a couple people here. I'm just saying, there are options. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, so true, so true. There tends to be this immediate thought that, okay, well, I'm doing a PhD or whatever my research is, whatever level it might be. I've got my topic and there's no one else doing this topic, therefore I'm on my own. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Like, yeah, as Dr. E said, you are supposed to be the expert in your field, or at least you'll become that expert. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a largely shared experience amongst other researchers, especially other first-time researchers. So you want to approach your institution, find out who else is new to this field, who else is facing the same struggles. Can I connect with them? You want to just have a quick Google search. There's loads of online communities that are centered around this experience of first-time researchers or new researchers, PhDs and so forth. You want to be just putting yourself out there and having conversations, because the research topic is unique to you, although not as unique as you might think. But the experience is 100% shared. And the more you can speak to people, even if it's just having a bit of a whine and a moan, the more you can share that experience, the happier and the healthier you're going to be throughout this process. And that's important, because you need to stay mentally well. To Dr. E's previous point, is you've got to factor in those breaks. You've got to factor in a life beyond just your research. You can't just get sucked into this thing. So it really speaks to the importance of deep dive, get fall in love with your research project, spend a little bit too much time in it. That's great. But you also need to establish some sort of daily routine where you are your own boss, where you're saying, okay, this is how I'm going to slice up my day, and I'm going to force myself to spend X amount of time on the research. I might have to force myself to spend X amount of time getting outside and getting some sunlight, talking to people, interacting with fellow human beings. You need to create that schedule. Otherwise, you're going to just get sucked into a hole where you're constantly crouched over your laptop, searching and reading literature and feeling hellishly overwhelmed and feeling inadequate and all that. And we'll talk about that in the next point. So you need to have some sort of structure in terms of a daily routine. And then sort of linking back to the previous point about creating goals and creating timelines and creating a project plan with your supervisor. That obviously is important for engaging with your supervisor, but it's also important for keeping you sane, because if you have a clear plan of action and you have a daily routine, that just stops you from falling into this pit of isolation and despair where you just feel like, oh, it's just an endless road and I have no idea where I'm going, and I can't see the clouds outside. I can't see any sort of progress because I don't really know what progress looks like. I haven't defined what that looks like. So you really, really want to put those little guardrails in place that sound so obvious, have a plan, have a project plan, have a schedule. But as Dr. E said, your entire academic experience up to now has been that all of that stuff's kind of been prepackaged for you and given to you, and you've got to be at this class by this time, and you've got to hand in this assignment by that time. And now all the guardrails are gone. And so you need to create your own guardrails. You need to create your own self-imposed set of restrictions and routines and so forth. And that might sound unattractive, but it is key to preserving your sanity through this process.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's one of the things that I discovered myself, and to circle back to the point that we made previously, it's one of the areas that you can avoid with respect to your relationship with your supervisor, chair, or committee member. Managing your own time well, making time for breaks, making time for engagement with your friends or other academics or your community, or building a community of other academics that you can share these stories with, just means that you don't necessarily, as you said before, just blurt all of that out all over your supervisor. So you're not taking all of those emotions and all of those frustrations and all of those confusions into your meetings with your supervisor or your committee members or your chairs, but rather you're segmenting those things and doing them in the appropriate places. And rest assured, your supervisors are perfectly comfortable and used to the idea that you might be talking about them behind their back. That's perfectly all right. I don't know that they care very much. So, if you've got friends, as I happen to get lucky enough to be during my degrees, you kind of got a couple of people that you can talk to, meet up after a supervisor meeting or a committee meeting, or speaking to your chair, or you've just got an email that's really frustrated you. The first thing you want to do is not reply immediately. The first thing you want to do is get it off your chest. And that doesn't necessarily mean to them. So, even if that means just meeting up with one of your friends or just calling them on the phone or just engaging with people, just sending a DM to somebody, just like, yo, I cannot believe what just happened with my supervisor. Just get it off your chest, get that stress out, go for a walk, talk about these things, air your emotions, air your thoughts, air your feelings. And if nothing else, if you can do this with an academic community, one of the things that's really, really beneficial about it is it starts to take away some of the illusions and some of the myths. There's one of the mistakes that we fall into, and it will lead on to a point that we're getting into next, is the idea that this is all somehow my fault, or that if anything's not going the way that it should be, it's somehow an indication of my inability to be able to do this properly, or that I need to be doing things better in some way, shape, or form. And really what it boils down to is your time just hasn't been managed as well as it could be, and you're sharing the wrong things in the wrong places. So rather than kind of pouring all your emotions out in your meetings with your supervisor, you have those emotional conversations or frustrated conversations or otherwise with your friends, family, other academics or academic communities. And then you reserve that space for the conversation with the supervisor for something functional and productive, and they'll appreciate it that much more. You'll feel as though you're making that much more progress. And in the process, you're taking the breaks that you need to, as you said, maintain your general sanity.
It's so, so important. And if you're sitting there wondering, okay, well, how do I structure this? How do I ensure that I manage my time as efficiently as possible? And what should breaks look like? And how do I approach all of that? I think one simple answer to that is the tried and tested Pomodoro technique, where you're just sitting down and you're breaking up your life into 30-minute segments. And that 30-minute segment, or those 30-minute segments, consist of 25 minutes where you are just sitting down and you're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. Whatever was on your to-do list, whatever was on your schedule, you're just sitting down and you're just in monk mode there. Nothing can distract you. Phone is awful. Phone's in airplane mode or whatever. Those 25 minutes, you're really just hammering through. And you can use a timer. There's online tracking tools. I think Toggle is a popular one. You can use whatever you like to track those 25 minutes. At the end of those 25 minutes, you lift your head up and you take a break for 5 minutes. You can make a cup of coffee, you have a cup of tea, whatever. You just get up and stretch, and you take those 5 minutes, and now your 30-minute segment is done, and you just rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. And if that sounds terribly simple and obvious, it's because it is. But we tend not to work like this. We tend to work with one hand on the keyboard, one eye on the iPhone, one half of our brain thinking about some other thing we need to do. And then we start opening this tab and that tab, and I need to send this person an email, and I've got Google Scholar open here. And you're just splitting yourself over, 20 different things. And that just doesn't work. This is the task of undertaking research, or at least portions of it, is exactly what Cal Newport speaks about in his work, Deep Work. And this is the kind of task where you just need to be zoned in. You need to just be focused and doing your deep work, and no distractions. But that doesn't need to be for 8 hours a day. It can be 25 minutes at a time, or whatever other distribution you like. But the key is just to have that dedicated focus time, and then dedicated non-focused time. Give yourself the breather. Allow yourself to be human. That is really, really useful.
Couldn't agree with you more. I've got images. I feel like I'm being targeted, slightly triggered again for the amount of work. I've got my phone in the background here, and I've got a whole bunch of things going on at the same time. That's cool. That's okay. It's all right. I feel like you're taking shots, but that's okay. No, but I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's absolutely true. And the key word that you used, I think, in any case, is that monk period of time. And I had this conversation with a student the other day. It's not just monkish. It's almost samurai. It's that idea. You're going that step further. So you're beyond monk, because at some point you're trying to slice away at those chunks of work, and that's perfectly fine. And sometimes you can get angry, and that's perfectly fine too. And sometimes you can be upset. Sometimes you can be frustrated. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes the process doesn't move the way that you want it to. So I can tell you endless stories about the amount of time that I spent, taking time. Here's me taking time. I, at some point during the course of my PhD, for example, decided to go away for a few months because I could do that. Went away for a few months to southern France and stayed there to do some writing. And while I was there, at some point got frustrated because I spent a full 2 weeks working on a single paragraph, because I just couldn't wrap my head around for a full 2 weeks. And the most frustrating thing in the world was at the time, that my partner who'd walk in and out of the house like, "So, did you make progress today?" I'm like, no, I didn't make progress. I'm still stuck on the same paragraph. But nothing helped more than being able to leave that environment, go out for a walk, go for a stroll, whether it was, with my partner at the time, and her and I would go for, strolls in the woods or what have you. But otherwise, it was just calling family, calling friends, talking to the people I care about, sharing stories with them, sometimes about my work, sometimes otherwise, exactly as you said, just engaging with being a human being as much as being a committed researcher, and just having that ability to be able to take a step away, forcing yourself into an environment where you can breathe again and come out of that stress, really allows you to refocus your energy, exactly as you said, get really, really zen about what you're doing, get really zoomed into what you're trying to achieve, and then just start slicing away at those chapters, you know?
All right, so let's jump into our third and final struggle for the day. And this is one that I'm sure most of us, at least those self-aware ones amongst us, can relate to. And that is feeling like a complete and utter imposter. Dr. E, what's this all about? What do we need to do? How do we stop feeling like we're the biggest frauds alive?
I mean, I don't know that we do. I don't necessarily know that you do. No, I'm kidding. You kind of do, but not entirely. So look, we all know what this feeling is. The imposter syndrome thing is something we're all familiar with, at least at some level, at some point, somewhere along the line. Typically, of course, in this case, we're talking about feeling like an imposter in your research. And it's a perfectly natural thing for you to experience because of the point that we made previously, which is to say that this is new. So whether you are doing this for the first time, or whether you're doing this for the second or the third, but at a different level, ultimately speaking, this is going to be a new experience to some degree or another. And it's perfectly natural in the course of that to start feeling as though, what if I'm faking it? What if I don't really know what I'm doing? What if they'll eventually realize that I have been faking it all of this time and I'm going to get found out? Well, the truth is, you kind of are faking it. You kind of are. And you kind of don't know what you're doing. And you kind of are figuring it out as you go along. But I'll be honest with you, if that was a reason to stop doing new things, I don't know that you'd ever do a new thing. That's how that feels whenever you do something new, that I'm going to mess this up, or that there's a possibility of me getting this wrong, or there's a possibility of me being found out, or there's a possibility that this is going to be discovered, that I'm not the most expert in this area, which again, you're not. You're becoming the most expert in this area, or at least trying to become an expert in this area to some level or another. And that's one of the things that you want to bear in mind about this experience of imposter syndrome, that it feels really personal. It feels like it has something to do with you personally. It has something to do with your background, who you are, what road you took to be able to arrive here. But the fact of the matter is that this is a near universal experience. And the truth of the matter is it's a healthy one. So as much as it's the case that, and I don't want to make this kind of misunderstood, although it is the case that it can be problematic, of course, and it is absolutely the case that imposter syndrome can stop you from working, that feeling of not really knowing what you're doing and maybe I don't belong here can give you cause to stop and not progress. But nevertheless, it can be a tool. And at least to my mind, or at least to our mind, or the minds of people who have done this or felt like imposters every single day throughout the course of their research. And even to this day, when I'm working with clients, I'm like, wow, do I really know what I'm doing? Even in these instances, we still have these same experiences. Don't judge me, but we still have these same experiences. The fact of the matter is that it's a really, really good tool to keep you honest. And that's not a bad thing. So I'd liken it often to the experience of fear or the experience of nervousness when you're out in, I don't know, the woods or in a dark environment. You're walking down the street and you don't know what's around the corner or what have you. And the fear that you start feeling might widen your eyes and your pupils start to widen up and your skin starts to get goosebumps and your hair stands on end and you can suddenly hear every crackle of everything in the environment. Now, as much as all of these are the signs and symptoms of somebody who's absolutely terrified, in that particular instance, that terror is precisely what's alerting you to danger. That terror is precisely what's alerting to what's around you. It's what's keeping you focused. It's what's keeping you aware of what's happening. And paying the wrong kind of attention to it is not helpful. That is to say, thinking that my fear or that my terror in this environment is somehow a reflection of my abilities or who I am as a person is a misunderstanding. It's a universal experience. It's an ability for you to be able to understand the environment you're in, less for you to be able to understand who you are as an individual. It's not really about that. So what that means ultimately, more than anything else, is about channeling that energy the right way, not necessarily squashing that energy or pretending it doesn't exist. So often I've heard people say that, there's 1,000 different ways to get rid of imposter syndrome, or there's 1,000 different ways to never have to feel like this again. And I'll be honest with you, some of the kind of weirdest human beings I've ever met are the ones who've never felt imposter syndrome. Like, these aren't necessarily the kinds of people you want to be, because the idea that you can walk into a brand new environment and just assume that you're the most confident person in the world, you know exactly what you're doing. I don't know that your supervisor is going to get along with you at that point, or your chair or committee member. Like, I feel like that way you might kind of bump into issues. The fact is that you do feel like an imposter, and it's because you are new to this environment and you are doing something that's entirely new. It's just the misinterpretation that there is a set way to do this and that I could be an imposter. You just can't. There is no imposter in this environment because everybody's learning. That's the nature of what academia is. It's the nature of the environment that you're in. It's how it's supposed to be experienced. So it's a question of channeling that energy the correct way, not squashing it, not putting aside, not pretending it doesn't exist, but rather embracing the feeling of, okay, if I feel like an imposter and I feel like I don't really know what it is that I'm doing, maybe what I mean is I should double check. Maybe triple check, maybe quadruple check the accuracy of my findings, maybe quadruple check the accuracy of my results, maybe check my interpretations against what the literature is saying, maybe double check my interpretations of the literature review or whatever else it is that I happen to be working on. And all of that double, triple, quadruple checking actually ends up reinforcing you as opposed to undermining you. By the end of the research, or by the time you start to get towards the end of your work, whatever level it is that you're working on, you can have that much more certainty that you really know your stuff. Because unlike everybody else who got nervous and didn't bother checking, you channel that energy into, okay, well, if I am an imposter, I need to make sure that what I'm doing is on solid foundation. So that by the time you get to a defense, you know exactly what you're talking about.
Well said. I think something that I often find myself reminding myself of, and reminding students of, and reminding coaches at Grad Coach of, is that a feeling of imposter syndrome is a good sign. It's really a good sign because it means that you're outside, or at least on the edge of your comfort zone. It means that you're growing. It means that you're challenging yourself. And it means that you are moving beyond your perimeter of safety, beyond your perimeter of things that make you feel comfortable. And so if you can recognize that, okay, I'm feeling a bit of imposter syndrome, as Dr. E says, acknowledge the feeling, acknowledge the emotion, but then take that as a good sign. Don't take it as a bad thing. Don't think of it as something that needs to induce further anxiety and negative emotion. Think of it as, okay, this is my clue. This is my little marker on the hiking trails that, hey, I'm going in the right direction. And if anything, when you start feeling very confident about something and that imposter syndrome is just completely and utterly gone, that's probably where you want to be asking yourself, wait a minute, what assumptions am I making here? What am I not considering? What are the ways in which I might be wrong? And so I think it's really, really useful, as Dr. E said, to reframe this thing, reframe it as imposter syndrome. 1, it's natural. 2, it's a good sign. And 3, it's not something that you necessarily want to get rid of. It's always good to use this question of, am I fully understanding the situation? Have I got all bases covered? Use that as your motivation. Use that as your fuel to be an absolute beast in terms of the work that you're doing, in terms of going and double checking and triple checking and really committing to understanding the problem that you're working on, as opposed to just being overwhelmed by it and feeling like, oh, this is a problem that I need to get rid of. I can do my research once I get rid of the imposter syndrome. No, you need to use the imposter syndrome to your benefit to really motivate you through the research. I think it's also really useful to, when you're feeling that imposter syndrome, is to just ask yourself the question, who am I comparing myself to when I feel like an imposter? We tend to, when these feelings of imposter syndrome come along, sometimes it's because we see a peer that seems to know a lot more than we do, or really looks like they've got everything going on. But quite often what we're doing is comparing ourselves to absolutely ridiculous sort of metrics. We're comparing ourselves to seasoned experts. You might, while you're reading a paper, you might be comparing yourself as a new author to this field, or as a new researcher to this field. You might be comparing yourself to someone who's been in the space for 20 years, 30 years. And of course, that's just absolutely ridiculous. So that's just something to keep in mind, that when you are feeling that imposter syndrome, 1, don't necessarily feel bad about it. Don't feel like you need to get rid of it. But 2, ask yourself, who exactly am I comparing myself to? Because just like all things in life, the objective here isn't to compare yourself to some random third party that's far more seasoned than you. What you want to compare yourself to is who were you yesterday? What was your level of knowledge yesterday? Am I continuously expanding and growing and becoming a better researcher? That's a much more healthy comparison and will help you just be a bit more level-headed about how you think about these things.
I completely agree with you wholeheartedly. And there are a million instances in which I've been victim of, or guilty, I should say, of doing exactly the same thing, setting absurd standards, setting absurd ideals. And the nature of the situation, to some degree or another, is that. I mean, I don't know why I'm on Greek philosophy today, but in some Platonic fashion, we set these kind of like ideal standards for ourselves and say that, I want to be the ideal researcher. I want to achieve the ideal degree and I want to have the ideal result. And what that means boils down to is maybe I should be studying ideally, right? And I should be achieving my research results ideally. And I should be spending this many hours a day, ideally focused on my work. And if I don't achieve that particular ideal, that's just evidence of my inability to be able to do what I'm supposed to be doing. Well, again, in my mind, at least, and I'm sure in yours too, and everybody are grad coaches, but in our minds, at least, it's the reverse. The fact that you can maintain that ideal, regardless of whether or not you actually achieve it on a day-to-day basis, that's not the goal. It's not being able to get to the highest peak on every single basis. It's exactly as you said, it's making progress. It's progress, not perfection. You kind of take a step at a time and you make your way through that process. But that you can conceive that ideal is an indication of your ambition and where you're trying to get to. And that's not a bad thing. Like if you want to be able to get to a point where you can be the perfect researcher, okay, maybe there's no such thing, but you can certainly be better than you were yesterday, exactly as you said. And where you want to get to the point where you can match, even if you are comparing yourself to somebody else and you want to be, Noam Chomsky plus 10, well, fine. I mean, if that's the intention and that's what you're trying to get to, somebody has to do better than these individuals. I don't think it's a bad thing to want to be better than the researchers that were produced yesterday, or better than the academics that were writing yesterday, or sharper than everybody else that you've ever read. I don't think it's a terrible thing to have the ambition, but it's set as an ambition, not as a standard for you to be able to achieve on a day-to-day basis. That's not how that works. It's exactly what you said. It's progress in small increments. On a day-to-day basis, it's incremental gains. You're 1% better today than you were yesterday. You're 0.5% better the next day than you were the day before that. So long as you're making these small incremental gains. Somebody once told me, in fact, let me be honest. See, I was trying to be humble. It's just not me. I'll be completely honest. It was me. I told somebody. It wasn't somebody told me. But I told somebody once, they asked me about my progress through my degree and why I'm not more frustrated or more annoyed that it's not making it as far as I'd like it to. And then what I said to them was, well, am I still putting one foot in front of the other? Yes. Well, so long as that's the case, I can't not arrive at the destination. Now, if the journey takes a little longer than I intended to, so be it. Maybe there were more winds and trips and turns in this journey than I thought there would be. And that's natural. I wouldn't know what that was going to take because I've not walked this path before. But regardless, so long as one foot still is being put in front of the other, so long as I keep stepping forward, imposter or no imposter, I cannot not arrive. And if that step is a small one, fine. If that step is a large leap, fine. If you bound your way through the path, fine. And if you take these tiny little crawling steps the way through the path, fine. There are no actual imposters in this environment. How you walk your path is entirely up to you, but that you continue to walk it, that you continue to put one foot in front of the other, that's the key issue. I'll say this. I'm reminded of this movie. So every time somebody brings up the issue of imposter syndrome, I'm always reminded of this one film. It's a film called Collateral, right? And there's a scene in Collateral where a cab driver, one of the main characters, is talking to another main character who happens to be a lawyer, and he's asking her about her process before, this major case where she has to defend, and she's going to be in the courtroom, and everything depends on her ability to be able to remember all the details of the case and all the evidence and so on and so forth. And she goes through this thing where she says the night before the case, she always feels terrible. She gets a horrible knot in her stomach. She throws up. She's convinced that she can't do this anymore, that she is faking it, and then eventually she's going to be found out, and then everybody's going to laugh at her in the courtroom. And then after she's thrown up and after she's gone through all of that struggle, takes a deep breath, composes herself, and then uses that energy to make sure she goes back over her evidence. She goes back over the information in her case. She goes back over all of the details. She recounts her opening statements. She recounts her closing statements. She reminds herself of who's going to be in the courtroom and how she's going to navigate those. And then she can walk in with the confidence of knowing that I've double, triple, quadruple checked this. You can't touch me. I know exactly what it is that I'm doing. You know how I know what I'm doing? Because I'm terrified. That's how I know what I'm doing. I can be absolutely sure energy. I did what I was supposed to do.
Yeah, channel that energy. And
speaking
of comparing ourselves to ridiculous ideals, I think a useful closing note for this discussion is to remember that Einstein himself said that I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. So there's the man that changed the world. considering himself an involuntary swindler. So that this whole idea of everyone feeling like a bit of an imposter, it's real and it's okay. And you don't need to beat yourself up about it. Channel that energy. Dr. E, it's been real. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. I think we've covered some great insights for research and for life in this session. So thanks so much.
No, much appreciated. I feel like we make being imposters look good. You know what I mean? Like this is how you're supposed to look as an imposter. I appreciate it. Thank you much. You know where you can find us. We'll be right here.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Grad Coach Podcast. Remember, you can grab a free copy of our popular dissertation and thesis template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. If you got value from this video, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll definitely want to check out this video next. I'll see you there.